And we are there together. If you take your Bibles tonight and turn to Joshua chapter 1, we're going to begin reading in verse 1 tonight. And it says in verse 1, "After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise and go over the Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I'm giving to them, the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon I have given you, as I said to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. And as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and of good courage, for to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go." Then I want you to look at these two verses specifically. "This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do everything according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you, be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid nor dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." I was reading a couple of weeks ago about a guy in Texas, and he and his family some years ago had sold their property. And a couple of years after they sold the property, they found out that the property had had a great deal of oil underneath it. And the people that had bought the property ended up finding that out and ended up making a fortune on all the oil that these people had owned at one point. And the guy was talking about how upset he was that when they owned the property, they didn't realize that there was oil on it until it was too late. They sold it and somebody else made the money. Most of the time in those sorts of stories, they take place in faraway places, maybe a different state or a different country, but it's certainly not any place that seems very close to us. But there was one case, and it happened not too far down the road here, down in the Branson area, evidently down in the Ozarks. And you may have heard about it, but there was another guy down there in that area that had land. I don't have the specific location, don't know the address, but he had some land and ended up finding out that there was oil on his land because he was out and ended up striking oil on his own land, and an oil company paid him multiple hundreds of millions of dollars for the right to drill on his property. And here this old poor hillbilly find out that he is a millionaire multiple times over, but didn't really know what to do, so he consulted his family, and his kinfolk said, "Jed, move away from there." And he didn't know where to go, so they said, where'd they say? "California is the place you ought to be." So they loaded up the truck and they moved to Beverly. That evidently, according to the story, happened down there in the Ozarks, where Jed Clampett and his family of hillbillies had the property, struck oil, and made all of this money. But for about 10 years, throughout the 60s, the Beverly Hillbillies was one of the most famous shows on television. Some things that you might not have known about it, I didn't know until I started looking it up, was that after the show had ended, some of the different people had gone on to do other things. The banker, Mr. Drysdale, had a secretary named Ms. Hathaway, and she, at 62 years old, ran for Congress as a congresswoman as a Democrat, and Buddy Epson was a Republican, and he campaigned against her. And she lost the election, and they did not speak again for the rest of their lives. They held it against each other because they could not see eye to eye on politics. Not only that, but the show's theme song, which is called "The Ballad of Jed Clampett," was sung by the bluegrass duo Flatt and Scruggs, and it made it #1 on the country charts and number 44 on the general charts. It was considered an incredible hit, made a lot of money for that group. They wanted John Wayne to show up on the show because apparently, evidently through the show, Granny kept talking about John Wayne if he would come. And so they reached out to John Wayne, asked him if he would appear. He said that he would. They began to negotiate his contract, and he said, "I do not want a salary." All he wanted was a bottle of bourbon. He took that as his salary to appear on the Beverly Hillbillies, the one episode he was on. Mattel made a Barbie doll after Ellie Mae Clampett, and she was sued, or they were sued by the actress because they didn't have the rights to use her as a doll, and they had to settle it out of court. Many cookbooks have been made based off of Granny's recipes. And so if you're wanting to go home tonight and make fried possum for the Senior Adult Lunch Tuesday, you can get a cookbook online with Granny's recipes. Don't call the office and ask if I want to try it. The answer is no. I'll just tell you that now. Jethro, did you know he had a twin sister named Jethrine? I didn't know that, but he had a twin sister in the show. In the show, Granny, who is supposed to be Jed's mother-in-law, who is supposed to be many years older than him, in reality, the actress was only 5 years older than the guy playing Jed Clampett. The show initially was not supposed to take place in Beverly Hills. It was supposed to take place in New York City, but they decided that it was going to be easier to film in California than it was New York, and so they moved it there. The house that you see in the show is a real mansion that is in Beverly Hills or in Bel Air, California. The house is almost 22,000 square feet. It has a landing pad. It has a 150-foot waterfall and a pipe organ. Where do you put a pipe organ in a house? I don't know where you'd stick it, but they've got a pipe organ in that one. And from the day the show came on, it was hated by critics. None of the critics ever gave it any good report. They all said it was horrible. They all just completely put it down. But the fans loved it. And at 6 weeks into the show, it was already #1 in the ratings, and it stayed that way through most of its run. And they said that even to this day, a couple of the episodes are some of the highest watched shows of all time in television history. And that throughout its run, at some times during its run, 50% of Americans tuned in to watch it as it was playing there on their television sets that evening. And so tonight, as we talk about that story, there is a story in the Bible that reminds me of the Beverly Hillbillies, and it is the story of the Hebrews when they are coming out of Egypt. The reason for that is that the whole point of the Beverly Hillbillies is that they were incredibly rich people who lived poor, right? I mean, that was the whole thing that made it funny, was here they lived in this 22,000 square foot house, but they scrubbed their clothes still like they did when they were back in the hills. They lived like they still lived like they were back in the Ozark Hills and all of that. Rich people living very poor. And that was really the story of the Hebrews. Born as slaves, but God delivered them out of Egypt, and he made them a promise. They understand God did not want them to spend time in the wilderness. The promise was to walk out of Egypt and walk into Canaan land, a land flowing with milk and honey. They could have sung the song that Cash just said, wait till you see our brand new home, the land flowing with milk and honey. But they didn't do that because of disbelief and unbelief. For 40 years they wandered in the wilderness. People who should have been rich by the blessing of God, living very poor. And so the verses we just read tonight, it starts out with the Hebrews in Egypt. And I want to remind you that when Joshua is born, he is born as a slave, just like his parents were and his grandparents and his great-grandparents, and as far back as 400 years. At one time, Joseph had been prime minister and all the Hebrews had come down, but that was 4 centuries ago. Many pharaohs have come and gone. And now all of a sudden, they're not anymore living in the land of Goshen, the best of Egypt, but now they are slaves. They are in poverty. They are out there doing Pharaoh's work and building Pharaoh's cities. And that's the life that Joshua grew up in, is doing the work of the Pharaoh and doing the work the Egyptians, being